If you have ever laughed at someone when they were already broken, thinking the moment would disappear forever, then this story will make you uncomfortable, because the prank that ruined my life for a night quietly rebuilt it for a lifetime. Before we go any further, if you enjoy stories where patience beats cruelty and intelligence outlasts revenge, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment saying, "Karma waits," because what you are about to hear proves that humiliation can be the seed of an unexpected comeback. My name is Daniel Cotter, and for most of my adult life, I believed love was something you earned by giving everything you had, which is why when Emily Lawson walked out of my life, she did not just take memories with her, she took my confidence, my savings, and my dignity, leaving me in a small rented apartment in Columbus, Ohio, staring at a phone that refused to ring. Emily and I had met in our mid-20s, both ambitious, both convinced we were destined for more. And when we married, it felt like we were building something real. But somewhere between her promotion into a social media-driven marketing firm and my slow grind as a freelance financial analyst, we began living in two different worlds, hers filled with attention, validation, and applause, mine filled with spreadsheets, long nights, and quiet optimism. And when she asked for a divorce, she framed it as growth, as self-discovery, as a necessary evolution. Even though 3 weeks later she was publicly dating her coworker, a man who loved cameras more than honesty. The divorce itself was clean on paper but brutal in reality, with Emily keeping most of the shared assets, because I wanted peace more than conflict, and that decision left me financially unstable and emotionally hollow. But what truly broke me was what happened 6 months later, when I finally thought I had stabilized enough to move forward. One evening, after a long day of consulting work that barely paid the bills, I received a message from an unknown number, claiming to be from a financial compliance office, warning me that my name had appeared in a fraudulent investment scheme, and that I needed to confirm details immediately to avoid legal escalation. And panic hit me like ice water, because as an analyst, reputation meant survival. I responded, carefully at first, then urgently, answering questions, providing clarifications, even agreeing to a recorded call. And for nearly an hour I felt my world collapsing as the caller hinted at frozen accounts and possible charges, until suddenly the voice on the other end laughed, not nervously, not awkwardly, but cruelly, followed by Emily's voice joining in, sharp and familiar, saying it was just a prank, that her new boyfriend thought it would be funny to see how I reacted, and before I could even respond, the call ended, leaving me staring at my reflection in a dark screen, humiliated, shaking and ashamed that the woman I once loved found entertainment in my fear. That night, Emily posted a vague story online about fragile egos and men who crumble under pressure, and although she did not name me, people who knew us understood, and messages began arriving, some asking if I was okay, others quietly distancing themselves because public embarrassment has a way of rewriting how people see you. I did not respond to Emily, I did not confront her, and I did not defend myself online, because in that moment anger felt useless, and I understood something important, that any reaction would only feed the narrative she wanted, a narrative where I was weak, reactive, and small. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I archived every message, saved the call, recording documented timestamps, and placed everything into a folder on my laptop labeled Simply Control. Not because I planned revenge, but because I needed grounding, and control was the one thing the prank had tried to steal. Over the following weeks, while Emily enjoyed attention and validation, I quietly focused on rebuilding my finances, not through shortcuts or emotional decisions, but through something I had always trusted: logic and patience. And I accepted a temporary consulting role analyzing risk exposure for mid-sized logistics companies. A field most people overlooked, but one that had become volatile due to supply chain disruptions. And as I studied patterns, I noticed inefficiencies that companies were bleeding money through without realizing it, especially in insurance premiums and contract penalties. And instead of simply reporting findings, I proposed optimized models, detailed projections, and alternative risk structures, and the results were immediate saving clients millions, which led to referrals, which led to more work, and slowly my income stabilized, then doubled, then quietly surpassed what it had been during my marriage. During this time, Emily's prank continued to echo, not through direct contact, but through mutual acquaintances who mentioned it casually, sometimes with a laugh, sometimes with sympathy, and each time, I chose silence, because silence is often mistaken for defeat. when in reality it can be strategy. What Emily never knew was that her prank had forced me to examine vulnerability, and in doing so it sharpened my instincts, and those instincts led me to notice something strange about her online presence. Subtle inconsistencies in her marketing claims, exaggerated growth metrics, and partnerships that did not align with verifiable data. And while I had no intention of interfering in her life, I could not unsee the red flags, especially because her firm specialized in influencer-driven financial promotions, a space dangerously close to regulatory boundaries. One evening, as I reviewed client documents, I cross-referenced public campaign disclosures with marketing performance reports Emily had shared online. And discrepancies appeared, small ones at first, then patterns, suggesting inflated engagement numbers and misrepresented returns, practices that could trigger serious scrutiny if examined by the wrong authority. And although I felt a flicker of vindication, I reminded myself that I was not seeking revenge, I was seeking stability, and stability required discipline. As months passed, my professional reputation quietly grew, and I was invited to speak at a regional financial risk conference, not as a headline name but as a practical expert, and the irony was not lost on me that the same calm, methodical voice Emily once mocked was now being listened to by people who valued substance over spectacle. And after the conference, a private equity firm approached me about a long-term advisory role, one that offered not just financial security but influence, and I accepted, understanding that influence was the most underestimated form of protection. Meanwhile, Emily's online persona continued to thrive superficially, but cracks appeared in comments, questioning transparency, delayed campaign results, and quietly disappearing partners. And although our lives were no longer directly connected, the world has a way of circling people back into relevance. Because one afternoon, I received an email from a compliance consultant asking if I would be willing to review marketing risk exposure for a firm under informal review. And when I opened the attached summary, I saw her company name, and in that moment, I realized that the prank which once stripped me of control had unknowingly placed me in the position to reclaim it, not through confrontation, but through consequence. As I stared at the screen, seeing Emily's company name framed in neutral corporate language, I felt no surge of triumph, only a slow, heavy awareness that life had quietly rotated the board while she was still playing for applause, and I agreed to the review under the condition of full professional independence. Not because I wanted proximity to her downfall, but because refusing would have meant allowing emotion to dictate my decisions, something I had learned never to do again. The documents I received over the next few days were extensive, filled with glossy presentations, confident projections, and influencer testimonials. Yet beneath the numbers told a different story, one of aggressive assumptions, selectively framed metrics, and risk exposure that had been ignored in favor of speed. And as I worked through the data late into the night, I realized the problem was not fraud in the dramatic sense, but something far more dangerous, a culture of exaggeration that blurred ethical lines until no one remembered where they were. The more I analyzed, the clearer it became that Emily's firm had built its success on momentum rather than structure. And momentum collapses the moment scrutiny arrives, which explained why regulators had begun circling quietly, asking questions through intermediaries like me instead of launching formal actions. I prepared a report that was precise, unemotional, and devastating in its clarity, outlining exposure risks, compliance gaps, and long-term financial consequences if corrective measures were not implemented immediately. And when I submitted it, I detached myself completely, reminding myself that professionalism meant letting outcomes unfold without interference. Days later, I was invited to a virtual meeting with the consulting group overseeing the review, and as faces filled the screen, serious and controlled, I noticed one square remained black, camera off, name displayed simply as Emily Lawson. And in that moment, memory pressed against restraint. But I kept my tone steady as the lead consultant summarized my findings and asked for clarification on several points. Emily did not speak at first, and when she finally did, her voice lacked the confidence. I remembered replacing it with forced calm as she challenged assumptions and defended strategies, yet every defense relied on narrative rather than evidence, and the room shifted subtly as professionals recognized the imbalance. I responded factually, referencing data sources, industry standards, and comparable cases, never once acknowledging our personal history, and with each exchange Emily grew quieter until the meeting ended with a decision to escalate the review, internally recommending immediate operational changes and temporary suspension of certain campaigns. After the call, I closed my laptop and sat in silence, not relieved, not satisfied, but aware that something irreversible had begun. And that awareness followed me through the following weeks as updates trickled in through professional channels. Emily's firm began losing clients, not dramatically, but steadily, as cautious partners withdrew pending clarity, and cash flow tightened, forcing layoffs that she framed publicly as strategic restructuring. Though insiders whispered about panic and confusion, I did not celebrate these developments, because watching a collapse from the inside had taught me that damage spreads wider than its source, affecting employees, families, and reputations. Yet I also understood that responsibility cannot be outrun forever. My own career continued to advance quietly, with the private equity firm expanding my role and entrusting me with oversight of multiple portfolio companies. And for the first time since the divorce, I felt not just stable but grounded, because my success was rooted in consistency rather than reaction. One evening, nearly a year after the prank, I received a direct message from Emily, short and carefully worded, asking if we could talk privately, not as adversaries, but as people who shared history, and I considered ignoring it, knowing silence had protected me before. Yet something told me that closure does not always come from avoidance, but from boundaries. We agreed to meet in a quiet public cafe, neutral ground. And when she arrived, she looked different, not older, but stripped of performance. Her movements less assured, her eyes searching for control that no longer responded on command. She apologized, not immediately, but after circling the subject, explaining pressure, influence, and how the prank had spiraled beyond intention. And when she finally acknowledged the harm, her voice broke, revealing fear rather than regret. Fear of losing everything she had built. I listened without interruption, not because I owed her patience, but because listening gave me clarity. And when she finished, I spoke calmly, telling her that the prank was not the worst thing she had done, that the worst thing was mistaking cruelty for power and attention for security, and that while I had no desire to see her fail, I also had no intention of shielding her from consequences she helped create. I made it clear that my professional actions were independent of personal history, that I would not intervene to soften outcomes, and that moving forward meant accepting accountability without expecting rescue. And she nodded, understanding that this conversation was not reconciliation, but reality. We parted without drama, and as I walked away, I felt lighter, not because I had confronted her, but because I had finally spoken without needing validation. Months passed, and Emily's firm eventually underwent forced restructuring under new leadership, with her stepping down quietly, her online presence fading as attention shifted elsewhere, proving that audiences move on faster than egos expect. And while some might call that revenge, I saw it as consequence intersecting with timing. My own financial comeback reached a point where money no longer defined progress, and I began mentoring young analysts, emphasizing ethics, patience, and the hidden cost of shortcuts. Lessons I had learned not from textbooks, but from humiliation. Occasionally I would think back to the night of the prank, the laughter on the line, the sudden drop of my stomach, and I realized that without that moment I might never have sharpened the discipline that ultimately rebuilt my life, because comfort dulls growth while discomfort demands evolution. The irony was complete when I was later invited to advise on regulatory frameworks addressing misleading digital marketing practices, contributing to standards that would prevent others from experiencing similar harm. And as I reviewed policy drafts, I understood that true revenge was not about watching someone fall, but about rising in a way that made their actions irrelevant. The prank that was meant to reduce me to entertainment had instead redirected my focus, hardened my principles, and multiplied my value, proving that when cruelty meets patience, patience does not need to strike back, it only needs to endure until the scales balance themselves. Time has a strange way of slowing down after chaos settles, and in that quieter phase of my life, I began to notice how deeply the prank had altered my instincts, not by making me suspicious of people, but by teaching me to separate words from patterns, because patterns never lie for long. My days became structured mornings filled with reviews of portfolio performance, afternoons with strategy calls, evenings with research, and somewhere in that routine I discovered peace, the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but stays consistent, and that consistency allowed me to see opportunities others missed. One such opportunity emerged when a mid-level fintech startup approached our firm seeking advisory support after struggling to regain investor trust following a failed product launch. And as I examined their internal reports, I saw echoes of Emily's former firm, not in intent, but in risk blindness, and instead of simply flagging issues, I proposed a complete restructuring of their financial narrative. shifting focus from hype to transparency, from aggressive promises to sustainable milestones. The process was slow and resisted at first, but over months, the company stabilized, regained credibility, and eventually attracted long-term investors, reinforcing my belief that patience, paired with honesty, outperforms spectacle every time. During this period, my personal life remained intentionally simple: no rushed relationships, no need to prove recovery, just space to rebuild identity beyond reaction. And that space allowed reflection on how easily love can become leverage when respect disappears. News of Emily surfaced occasionally, not directly, but through industry whispers about consulting gigs she failed to secure, partnerships that fell through, and the quiet difficulty of rebuilding trust once it has been traded for attention. And while some part of me felt sympathy, another part understood that empathy does not require interference. One afternoon, I received an invitation to speak at a National Finance Ethics Summit, a platform far larger than anything I had experienced before, and as I prepared my speech, I chose not to share technical triumphs, but a story about humiliation, silence, and restraint. Without names, without blame, focusing instead on how moments designed to break us can become filters that refine our judgment. The response was overwhelming, not applause-driven, but thoughtful, with attendees approaching me afterward to share their own experiences of betrayal and comeback, reinforcing that resilience resonates deeper than revenge ever could. Financially, my comeback had matured into security, diversified investments, advisory equity stakes, and long-term planning that no longer depended on constant hustle. And that security gave me a choice I had never had before: the choice to slow down intentionally. I reduced my workload slightly, invested time into writing, documenting lessons from my journey, not as a memoir but as a guide for professionals, navigating ethical gray zones in high-pressure environments. And through that process, I realized how easily people justify small compromises until consequences appear sudden and unfair. Emily reached out once more during this time, not to ask for help, but to acknowledge the summit speech, recognizing herself in the story without accusation. And her message was simple: admitting that watching me succeed quietly forced her to confront how much of her confidence had been borrowed from external validation. I replied politely, briefly, wishing her clarity, not reconciliation, because some chapters serve their purpose and do not require revisiting. As years passed, the prank transformed in my memory from a wound into a marker, a dividing line between who I was and who I became. And that shift allowed gratitude to replace resentment, not gratitude for the act, but for the direction it pushed me toward. I began funding scholarships for students studying finance ethics, anonymously at first, then openly because transparency felt aligned with everything I had rebuilt, and seeing those students approach their careers with caution and integrity felt more rewarding than any personal victory. The ultimate irony arrived unexpectedly when a documentary team contacted me about featuring my work in a series exploring accountability in modern business. And as filming progressed, they asked about the moment that changed my trajectory, and I spoke honestly about the prank, the humiliation, and the silence that followed, emphasizing that revenge fantasies fade quickly, but disciplined growth compounds quietly. When the episode aired, responses poured in, not sympathy, but respect. And that distinction mattered, because respect is earned through consistency, not performance. Emily's name surfaced briefly online after the episode, not in praise or criticism, but as a footnote, reminding me that narratives eventually find their rightful proportions. Looking back, I understood that the prank did not make me successful, but it removed illusions that were slowing me down. Illusions about fairness, closure, and the need for acknowledgement. And without those illusions, progress became efficient. My unexpected financial comeback was never about reclaiming what was lost, but about building something that could not be taken again, rooted in discipline, foresight, and emotional restraint. The cruelty that once felt unbearable became irrelevant against the scale of what followed, proving that the most effective response to humiliation is not retaliation, but evolution. Because when you outgrow the room where you were mocked, the laughter no longer reaches you. By the time my life reached a rhythm that felt permanent, I understood that growth does not announce itself with fireworks. It arrives quietly, disguised as routine, and it was during that routine that the final ripple from Emily's prank revealed itself in a way I never anticipated. The private equity firm I advised decided to expand into consumer financial education platforms, an area plagued by misinformation. and exaggerated promises, and I was tasked with leading due diligence on potential acquisitions, one of which was a struggling digital media brand that specialized in viral finance content, flashy, controversial, and constantly skirting ethical lines. As I reviewed their archives, patterns emerged that felt uncomfortably familiar: the same engagement manipulation tactics, the same inflated success narratives, and buried within their partnership history was Emily's former firm, listed as a short-term strategic collaborator during its peak, a connection that raised immediate concerns. My report to the investment committee was blunt, recommending against acquisition unless leadership committed to structural transparency and ethical oversight. And while some executives hesitated, tempted by the brand's visibility, the data ultimately prevailed, saving the firm from what would have been a reputational liability disguised as opportunity. That decision solidified my standing not as a profit maximizer, but as a safeguard, someone trusted to see beyond noise. And with that trust came influence that extended beyond spreadsheets into shaping values. Around this time, Emily's professional struggles became more visible, not through gossip, but through her attempts to re-enter the industry under rebranded identities, consulting titles that changed frequently, and public posts that leaned heavily on reinvention narratives without substance. And while I noticed, I did not engage because detachment had become instinctive rather than forced. The real test of closure came unexpectedly when a former colleague of Emily's reached out, asking if I would consider a private advisory session with her, framed as a chance for her to learn from mistakes and rebuild ethically. And I sat with that request longer than expected, weighing whether helping would compromise boundaries or reinforce growth. Ultimately, I agreed under strict conditions: no personal history discussion, no favors, no shortcuts, only professional guidance, because true integrity is consistent even when tested emotionally. The session took place, virtually structured and formal, and Emily arrived, prepared, not defensive, not performative, but visibly humbled, asking precise questions about compliance, transparency, and long-term trust rebuilding. And as I answered, I saw a version of her that had been absent during our marriage, one willing to listen without seeking validation. When the session ended, I made it clear that guidance did not equal endorsement, and that rebuilding trust requires time and restraint, not narratives. And she accepted that without resistance, marking the first interaction between us that felt grounded in reality rather than illusion. Afterward, I felt no resurgence of old emotions, only confirmation that distance had transformed pain into perspective. And that perspective was now one of my greatest assets. My own projects expanded further, including advisory roles for regulatory bodies and academic institutions. And with each role, I reinforced the same principles: data over drama, patience over reaction, accountability over image. Financially, my portfolio reached a point where active management became optional, allowing me to focus on impact rather than accumulation. And that shift altered how I measured success, moving from net worth to influence integrity. The prank, once a source of shame, had become a teaching tool I used selectively, not as a grievance, but as evidence that humiliation can either fracture identity or refine it, depending on response. Public recognition followed, not celebrity, but respect within circles that valued substance, and with it came the temptation to finally tell my story openly, to name names, to expose motives. But each time the thought surfaced, it felt unnecessary because the truth had already manifested through outcomes. Emily continued her slow rebuilding, occasionally succeeding, occasionally failing, but always under scrutiny she could no longer manipulate. And while some might interpret my involvement in her advisory session as forgiveness, I saw it differently. It was neutrality, strengthened by boundaries. As years layered over memory, the prank lost its emotional charge, becoming a reference point rather than a scar. And that transformation signaled completion of a cycle I once believed would define me forever. I began planning a long-term initiative focused on ethical financial storytelling, aiming to counteract the damage caused by viral misinformation. And as I assembled the team, I realized that many of the values guiding the project were born directly from that moment of betrayal. Irony shaping purpose in ways no revenge ever could. The world moved forward, trends shifted, names faded, but the foundation I built remained steady. And one quiet evening, reviewing early results from the initiative, I understood that my unexpected financial comeback was not the climax of the story. It was the byproduct of choosing restraint when reaction felt justified, and discipline when collapse seemed easier. This realization carried a final lesson: that the most lasting victories are not visible in the moment they occur. They reveal themselves gradually, through stability, through respect, and through the quiet knowledge that what once tried to break you, now lacks the power to even define you. The final shift happened so quietly that I almost missed it, because true endings rarely arrive with drama, they arrive with certainty, and that certainty settled in me on an ordinary morning when I reviewed my accounts, my commitments, and my peace, and realized there was nothing left to prove, fix, or reclaim. The prank that once reduced me to fear had lost every trace of authority over my thoughts, and what remained was a life built deliberately layer by layer, with decisions that no longer revolved around reaction to others but alignment with myself. My ethical finance initiative expanded beyond projections, partnering with universities, nonprofits, and even media platforms that once thrived on exaggeration. And watching those institutions adopt transparency standards felt like witnessing a cultural correction rather than a personal win. Invitations came from places I once admired from a distance: policy roundtables, advisory boards, long-term investment councils, and each role reinforced the same truth, that credibility compounds the same way capital does, slowly at first, then undeniably. Emily's presence in my life faded completely, not because of conflict, but because relevance dissolved naturally. And when I eventually heard that she had found modest stability working quietly under someone else's leadership without spotlight or narrative control, I felt no satisfaction or sadness, only neutrality, because her journey was no longer connected to mine. What surprised me most was how often people asked if I ever regretted not retaliating, not exposing, not humiliating her the way she had tried to humiliate me. And my answer remained consistent: retaliation would have kept me anchored to the moment she created, while restraint allowed me to move beyond it. Financially, my comeback reached a point where legacy planning replaced growth strategy, and I structured trusts, long-term funds, and educational endowments designed to outlive attention cycles. Because wealth that serves only ego dissolves faster than money itself. I began speaking less frequently, choosing quality over quantity. Because silence had once protected me, and now it preserved clarity. Occasionally, someone new in my life would discover fragments of my past: the divorce, the prank, the public embarrassment, and they would look at me differently for a moment, searching for bitterness, but they never found it. Because bitterness requires unresolved attachment, and I had resolved mine through progress. The most powerful realization arrived when I understood that my unexpected financial comeback was never about money. Money was simply the scoreboard people could see, while the real victory was internal. Sovereignty, the ability to remain composed when tested, ethical when tempted, and patient when provoked. The prank failed, not because Emily suffered, but because I refused to let her define the terms of my response. And in doing so, I rewrote the trajectory of my life without ever announcing it. Years later, when I finally sat down to document the full story privately, not for publication, but for personal closure, I noticed something striking: the prank occupied only a small portion of the narrative, while the growth that followed filled pages, proving that pain feels dominant only while it is unresolved. If there is one lesson that outlived every consequence, it is this: cruelty demands reaction to survive, and when you deny it that reaction, it collapses under its own emptiness. I no longer measure success by who notices, who applauds, or who regrets their actions. I measure it by consistency, by the absence of chaos, by the ability to wake up without resentment and sleep without anxiety. The night that once haunted me has become irrelevant, not because it was forgiven, but because it was outgrown. And outgrowing pain is the quietest form of revenge available to anyone willing to endure the long game. If this story showed you that patience can outperform cruelty and discipline can rewrite destiny, now is the moment to support the channel by liking this video, subscribing for more real stories where intelligence wins over impulse, and leaving a comment about what part of this journey stayed with you the most, because sometimes the strongest comeback is not loud, it is lasting.